Hello everyone. Today we hope to discuss visual illusions. Before we get to that, however, we should talk about vision and the role of the retina in it. Let's start from the very beginning. We see two types of objects, luminous objects and non-luminous objects. Luminous objects emit their own light. They produce light in and of themselves. They glow. Non-luminous objects, on the other hand, do not glow. They simply reflect the light of others. Luminous objects include the sun and the lamp on your nightstand. Non-luminous objects include things like the moon. The moon doesn't glow in and of itself, but we see it because it reflects the light of the sun into our eyes. Now it's your turn. Can you tell me whether this Christmas tree is luminous or non-luminous? That's right, it's non-luminous. Now can you tell me about the lights that are working currently on this Christmas tree? Yep, they're luminous. Now, once luminous objects shoot light into your eye, or non-luminous objects reflect light into your eye, the light goes directly to the back. It goes to a thin layer of light-sensitive cells known as the retina. The retina consists of 3 layers. The top layer, or the layer that light actually reaches first, consists of photoreceptors. Then the light travels through a layer of cells known as bipolar cells. And finally, the light goes through ganglion cells, which then terminate on the optic nerve. Let's go through this again, layer by layer. Light first reaches a layer of cells known as photoreceptors. These cells are sensitive to light and are the first to receive light when it comes through the eye. We have 2 categories of photoreceptors. We have rods and cones. And these 2 categories have 3 main differences. Number 1, rods are not sensitive to color. In other words, they're colorblind. They see in black and white. Cones, on the other hand, are sensitive to color, and they make color vision possible. While we only have 1 type of rod, we actually have 3 types of cones. We have cones that are sensitive to short wavelengths of light, blue wavelengths, cones that are sensitive to medium wavelengths of light, green wavelengths, and cones that are sensitive to long wavelengths of light, red wavelengths. Number 2, rods are highly sensitive to bright light. In other words, they work well in dim lighting. They're crucial for night vision. Cones, on the other hand, are not very sensitive to bright light. They don't pick it up very well, and as a result, they need bright light to function. And number 3, rods are not very sensitive to fine detail. Small objects, objects far away, intricate objects. Cones, on the other hand, are quite detail-oriented. Now that we've been through the first layer, the layer of photoreceptors, let's talk about layer number 2, which consists of bipolar cells, and layer number 3, which consists of ganglion cells. Bipolar cells are named as they have 2 poles. They have a single cell body and an axon branching off in either direction. One leads to layer number 1, the photoreceptors, and the second axon leads to layer number 3, the ganglion cells. Ganglion cells are responsible for collecting all of the information and sending it off to the brain via the optic nerve. There are roughly 100 million photoreceptors, but only about 1 million ganglion cells. As a result, there are about 100 rods and cones that feed into each and every ganglion cell. As I said earlier, these ganglion cells transmit their information into the optic nerve. The optic nerve then extends to the lateral geniculate nucleus, a portion of the thalamus. That's all for today. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Now that you have a basic understanding for how the visual system works, let's dive into some of the more exciting stuff, specifically how our visual system can be fooled into giving us altered perceptions of reality. The first category of visual illusions that we're going to be discussing are called Gestalt illusions. The term Gestalt is actually the German word for pattern or configuration. This school of psychology deals with the study of perceptions that go just beyond the raw visual stimuli. In other words, it deals with visual perception that is registered as more than just the sum of the visual inputs. Here's a classic example to show you what I'm talking about. Imagine two people walk into a field of trees. A person operating without Gestalt perception would simply say they see a lot of individual trees, while a regular person with Gestalt perception would claim that they see the forest. In other words, the non-Gestalt person is seeing the parts, while the Gestalt person is seeing the whole scene. The first Gestalt illusion we're going to check out is one involving depth perception. Take a look at this picture of three people. Which one is taller? What about now? By now, it should be obvious that they're all actually the same height. The reason this illusion is considered a Gestalt illusion is because visual inputs that were separate from the people actually influence your perception or misperception of them. The reason this illusion works has to do with the way your brain processes the world, specifically depth perception. In order to make sense of the world at a speed that would allow you to function in everyday life normally, your brain makes use of heuristics. Now, heuristics might seem like a complicated word, but in this context, it's really only important that you know that it's essentially a fancy word for cognitive shortcuts. In the case of the waving people illusion, your brain uses converging lines, which are normally a reliable visual cue in everyday life, to add a perception of depth to the picture. Now, because we have the same size person appearing at different depths in the image, our brain creates a perception, or it makes us think and believe, that the person placed further to the right must be larger because its absolute size is not changing despite being placed further back. The next Gestalt illusion we're going to cover is reification, which is basically the neuroscientist's fancy way for saying visual autofill. Similarly to how your phone uses your past messages to predict what you're going to type when given only a part of the word, your brain uses past experiences to construct your perception of something when only presented with parts of whatever it is you're looking at. In the case of visual autofill, these parts of a visual stimuli are straight or curved lines, where portions of the lines are not visible. In nature, you rarely ever see separated lines that align with each other perfectly, but are not part of the same object or thing. Our brain uses this extensive history of seeing separate but aligned lines to create perceptions of a whole. This is actually another example of heuristics in action, and gives rise to some pretty neat illusions. Take these images for example. While you're consciously aware of the separate components of each figure, because your brain uses reification to connect the lines, your perception is that of a triangle or a spiked ball, and if you're feeling particularly imaginative, a sea creature with part of its body obscured from view. To further drive the point home for how your brain uses reification when looking at disconnected but aligned lines, let's see what happens when we misalign the components of these figures. All of a sudden, the triangle is nowhere to be seen, the spiked ball is unrecognizable, and your sea monster is in pretty poor condition. Well, that's all we have for Gestalt illusions today. I hope you learned something. Next up, we have afterimages and habituation.
There are many optical illusions that happen because of how the retina works. We're going to go ahead and take a look at 3 different illusions that show just how the retina plays a role in processing pictures before the information gets sent to the brain. The first illusion we're going to look at is called the black dot illusion. Go ahead and stare at the black dot in the center and keep your eyes fixed on it for a few seconds. What's starting to happen to the shadow around the dot? Is it starting to disappear for you? You see, our brains are more inclined to pay attention to information that is changing instead of information that is staying the same. Why does this happen though? From an evolutionary standpoint, it doesn't really make much sense to pay attention to a patch of grass that's just chilling out and not really bothering anyone. Unless that patch of grass starts moving, then we might be in trouble and should be alerted. Our brains have the tendency to tune out any information that is constant, and this helps to ensure that our brains don't get sensory overload. This whole process is known as habituation. This happens with our other senses as well, not just with vision. For example, imagine if you were always aware of the feeling of your clothes against your skin, the feeling of your tongue in your mouth, or the sound of the air conditioner in the room. This next illusion we're going to look at is called the American flag illusion. Go ahead and stare at the bottom right corner of the orange box for about 15 or so seconds. And after that time, I'm going to go ahead and flip to a blank slide. What did you see on the screen? Did you see the American flag's real colors? What is happening here? Whenever you see a color, the cones in the retina that correspond to this color are going to start sending signals to the brain. But this process takes a lot of energy. So whenever you see this bright color, the cone cell is starting to get tired. And whenever you take away the bright color, that cone wants to take a break and will send less signals to the brain. There are a lot of other color cone cells in the eye, though, that are randomly firing and still sending information to the brain. This is what causes you to see this negative image of the American flag. And this process happens whenever you close your eyes. Go ahead and see for yourself. Close your eyes. Do you start to see random pinpricks of light? This is happening because of the random firing. Your eyes are still sending information to the brain even when there's nothing there. This last illusion we're going to look at is called the lilac chaser illusion. Go ahead and stare at the cross in the center. After looking at it for a few seconds, does the missing dot start to look green? After staring for a few more seconds, does it look like the green dot is chasing the purple dots in a circle? Well, this illusion is a combination of the first two illusions. The green color is the negative after image of the lilac dot, and the disappearing lilac dots happen because of habituation.
In order to determine the color of an object, we rely on relative judgments. However, these judgments can end up being misleading, as you'll see in the following visual illusions. Look at the following picture. Is tile A darker than tile B? Tile A may appear to be darker than tile B, but in reality, the tiles are actually the same color. So why does tile B appear lighter? Our brain tries to determine the true color of an object based on surrounding cues. The shadow that falls on tile B makes the tile the same color as tile A, but our brain tells us the color that tile B would be without the shadow. Thus, tile B appears lighter than tile A. Although our brain's tendency to try to determine the true color of an object misled us in the previous illusion, this is actually really useful in real life. A red brick house may appear to be brown, depending on shadows and the time of day. Despite the apparent color change, our brain can identify that it is the same house. If our brain did not try to determine the true color of an object, it would be very difficult to navigate the world. Take a look at this image. How many colors do you see in the picture? You may see 5, but there are actually only 3 colors, 1 shade of red, 1 shade of green, and white. So why do we see more? In our retina, we have cone cells that detect red and cone cells that detect green. When we look at the image, our red and green cones in the retina talk to each other. When red cells are activated, they inhibit or quiet the green cells, and when green cells are activated, they inhibit and quiet the red cells. When both the red and green cells are active, they inhibit each other to some extent, which gives off a muted or darker tones in areas where red and green are next to each other. This is called lateral inhibition. Lateral inhibition is important because it helps to increase the contrast between two edges and make objects pop out. Look at the image on the screen. We can see where each shade of gray ends because lateral inhibition accentuates the edges.